Okay, so we are ending the Beatitudes today. So we are in chapter 5 of the book of Matthew. Um, and we we know that like Jesus has just started his public ministry and he picked some disciples. He's performed some miracles. So he's kind of like caught the people's attention at this point. And then he starts what's called the Sermon on the Mount. And the other gospels kind of describe it as him like standing on a mountainside or a hillside and people sitting around him but like below him, if that makes sense. And this is like his first big sermon, I would imagine, like in front of a big group of people. And I mean, we've talked extensively about how the Old Testament Jews, what they thought and how they were practicing their faith. Um, and so I want you to keep that in your mind when we're reading through the beginning of chapter 5. It all is like very different than what the Jews were used to. Like Jesus's message was so different than what the Jews were used to hearing from rabbis in their synagogues. And, for people who really wanted true belief, it was a breath of fresh air almost that they didn't have such this huge burden that the Old Testament Jews were carrying that they felt like they had to earn their salvation. I mean, when we say, and it's funny because even 2,000 years later, people are still the same. Um, if I would tell you like you had to earn your way into heaven, like we are forever separated from God through sin, and you need to just behave enough to get to heaven. Um, it is that burden, that task, you will quickly learn that it's impossible to do that without Jesus. That in our own strength, a minute by minute struggle, to just behave in the eyes of God and get to heaven is an arduous task, that I don't think any of us would want to willingly take on. And remember, guys, it's not a worldly definition of good. It's God's definition of good, which is, it's not just, okay, and we'll see in a little, in a section below where we are right now, where Jesus says, it's not just about not committing murder. That's what the Old Testament, Ten Commandments said. But truly, if you harbor hate in your heart, that's just as though you committed murder. So a thought can be a sin. And so, one thought, one lustful thought about somebody who's not your spouse is just as though the sin is to the caliber of if you would have actually committed adultery in the eyes of God. And so when we start looking at God's definition of good and what is worthy of salvation, we start to realize that there is no earthly way that you and I can do this on our own. Okay. So I'm going to go through the beginning and we kind of ended, I think, on verse 10 or 11. So chapter 5, book of Matthew, I'm reading NIV, New International Version. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach. He said, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So we talked about how in all this little section of his sermons called the Beatitudes. We talked about how Jesus kind of hits the ground running in his ministry because what he's saying is all of these, when he says blessed or the blank, every characteristic that he has shared is not a characteristic that a person of the world would want to identify with. So, a person of the world would not want to be identified as a person who's mourning or who is meek or who has hunger or thirst or like these are just descriptions and adjectives in a worldly sense that are not admirable, but in the eyes of God, they are absolutely admirable, because it's about us submitting our lives to God and like recognizing that you and I are sinners and that we are separated from the Lord. And um, if we carry pride with us so much and we're like, I don't need to be any different because I'm perfect. That is what the world says, and what Jesus is saying is if you're listening to, religious people who are preaching that, they're wrong, because truly these are the things that God finds as admirable. People who mourn over their sin, people who, they're never going to be quenched. Like their needs are never going to be met without the Lord. That's the kind of admirable qualities God finds in his believers. So it we talked about how John MacArthur said that it was kind of it's a paradoxical set of his sermon because what it's opposite of what you would think it would be. It's not necessarily a person who's mourning over loss. It's a person who's mourning over their sin. And so it's like it's opposite. Um, okay. So I feel like we've covered the Beatitudes ad nauseum. This is kind of the last little part of the Beatitudes, which kind of sums up, I think, all of them. It's verse 11. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and say all kinds of evil things against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So Jesus is saying, if you carry all of the qualities of the Beatitudes that I've talked about so far, people are going to persecute you and insult you and spread lies about you, um, and in some ways, like physically hurt you. And he says, don't be upset about that because truly that is a mark of a good Christian. Because, guys, like think about, like true Christianity, having true belief means that we have to go toe to toe with the world sometimes. It means that we are set apart, we're holy, um, and the way we carry ourselves and live our lives is different than the world. And so when we're doing that, we often become in conflict with the world, Our advice and how we live and how we raise our children and the kinds of marriages that we have are different than the world. And whenever you're different than the world, you're going to be in conflict with the world because sometimes that's going to require that you and I step out in faith and say things that are not popular. And so Jesus says that is the mark of a good Christian that you are being persecuted. And he says, truly, like, consider it joy because that's how the prophets who came before me, that's how they were treated. And yeah, guys, we see that like Jesus is crucified on the cross. We see all of the disciples suffered um terrible, painful deaths for spreading the gospel. John MacArthur theorizes that Paul was actually beheaded for spreading the word of God. Um, and so, if we, I want you to think about it in comparison. If people in town are talking about you because you're clinging tight to your Christian values, um, in the grand scheme of things, we're not experiencing the persecution to the level that Jesus and his disciples did, or that any of the previous um, prophets did. But I mean, listen, it's uncomfortable. And I feel like sometimes that persecution is the reason why some Christians scour back. They don't speak out when God was calling them to speak out, or they try to look like the world because they don't want to seem like they're different. Um, it's almost like peer pressure. Like you don't want to be different than everybody else. Um, but guys, like like we need to be like I feel like Jesus lived boldly for you and me, and so we need to live boldly for him. And sometimes that is having not popular opinions, and that's okay. Like don't worry about what other people think about you. Like that's completely fine. When we are worried, like we need to worry about what God thinks about us, not what other people think about us. And if you in prayer are comfortable with how you're living your life, and let me rephrase that. If you in prayer are confident that God is comfortable with how you're living your life, um, and how you're, operating and the opinions that you have and the way you're conducting yourself, then it doesn't matter what anybody else says. And listen, y'all know there are always going to be haters. Okay, verse 13. Well, wait, I wanted to ask y'all, we don't do this enough, and I feel like we need to. Does anybody that on this morning like have a favorite beatitude or like something that you got from the beatitudes that you thought was profound that you wanted to share?
Today's one actually so far has got me really intrigued because I actually have a question if that's okay.
Yeah.
So if we have the thought of okay, a sin. So if I have the thought of someone did something to my kid and I want to kill them,
Yeah.
I should just do it because that's already a sin.
No. Now, like,
Okay, I
the thought is the sin, and you need to be thinking like, I need to live a life honoring of God, and that requires forgiveness and gentleness and peacemaking. And listen, Keisha, I don't want to make you think that the all of that happens contemporaneous with the thought, because sometimes that takes a lot of time. But then that just is going to be committing you to prayer more and more and more.
right. Okay.
Listen, I get that completely. I have clients who come in that their spouses have cheated on them. And I'm supposed to try to preach to them about forgiveness and going to marriage counseling and asking yourself, did you do anything to contribute to the environment where your spouse is cheating on you? And
Right.
I know the world is saying, Jury, you're victim shaming or you're whatever, but that's the Christian call for me to do, and listen, sometimes forgiveness takes a long time, but you have to, what Pastor Matt would refer to, Keisha, as holding the thought captive. So you recognize you had the thought, you recognize that it's sinful, you hold it captive, and then you pray about it and you say, like, Lord, I don't want to feel this way. And I just seek your wisdom and um, pour out your heart. Because listen, he wants to be in communication with us. So you say, Lord, I have this hate right now because I love my child so much and I don't want her to feel blank. And, like he wants that communication.
Right. I understand that much
Good,
better now.
good question, girl. Anybody else have like a beatitude that they thought was like profound? That's okay if you didn't. Okay, so we're moving on. We are on verse 13. I never understood this part, or I always like just misinterpreted it, I think. Okay, verse 13. He says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." So, salt and light is probably a biblical concept you've heard of before. Um, I don't know why Jesus decided to put them together right here. He just did. But I want you, okay, so being the salt of the earth, I guess in my brain, we've always used salt in comparison to sweetness. So, sweetness is good, saltiness is bad. I don't know. That's just, don't be salty when people say that. Um, but in this context, Jesus is saying saltiness adds flavor and it is set apart from the bland. And so um being the salt of the earth is a good thing in this context. Um and so he's really talking about holiness and righteousness. So do we look different than everybody else? Do we look different from the world? Because we should. We, salt is the exception and blandness is the general rule. And so we should be set apart. Kristen said they used salt for preservation in the past. If it loses its saltiness, they could not preserve food and they threw it on the ground like sand. Look at that. Girl, good job. Um, and listen, if we think of salt in that context, then we think about how things will rot without salt, you know? And so thank you, Kristen. That's such a good bit of context.
I've heard this preached on a good bit, this one little part, and that was one thing I always took from it because we use salt like seasoning,
Right.
but they were like, no, it was like in the past they used it for preservation of like meats and whatever else.
It's a very good point. Um, and so guys, we need to be like if you pick this up, just that we need to be separated and holy and righteous and look different than the world. And so remember that this is all part of Jesus's overall theme in this little port where he is saying, like, all of you Jews, this is how you've all been living your lives, where you think you can earn your own salvation and you're going through all these motions all the time. But truthfully, these are the concepts God finds pleasing, is being holy and set apart and not looking like everybody else. So it's like he's showing them the real faith in God and not this manufactured one that they've created. And so you'll see the theme through this is constantly being set apart from the norm. Okay, so the next little part we talked about light. And guys, we've discussed how light is such a huge theme in the New Testament. Um, a ton of times. When things were bad, it happened in the darkness. And when things were good, it happened in the light. That Jesus was arrested at night. Nicodemus came and visited Jesus and talked to him about his faith at night. When you didn't want to be seen, things happened in the darkness. And we know even now, most crime is committed at night. We That's just the imagery that we're used to, where bad things happen in the darkness. And when you shine light on a situation, it means that you see it for what it really is. And he says here, we need to be the light. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hillside cannot be hidden. So he says, when you have a lamp, you don't put it under a bowl, you put it on a stand for everyone to see. And so, again, guys, like he's saying, in this dark world, you are a light. When we really have allowed the gospel to penetrate our hearts and we accept salvation from God, we then shine the light of Christ in a dark world. And so he says, we don't find out this secret, this prize and hide it. We're supposed to share it with other people. And so he says, that in all of this dark world and these dark situations, we need to be shining light. He said, in the same way, let your light shine before others that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Many times in the New Testament, they make this example of how a non-believer is going to see how you're living. And when the Holy Spirit's working in their life and, really tempting them with salvation, they're going to be able to recognize that you are different. And then they're going to ask you about why you're different. And so, in this image that Jesus is painting right here, he's saying they're going to see your light. They're going to see your good deeds. They're going to see the fruit of your faith. And then they're going to ask you about your faith and what makes you different than the world. And that's kind of what Jesus is talking about right here. And that whenever we are shining the light of Christ, truly we are glorifying our Father in heaven. And so all of the things we do is, and the way we live our lives is not for a pat on the back. And it's not for people to say, oh, look at her, look at how she's living, she's living biblical, she's, whatever. It's about glorifying God, and that should be our goal in our Christian walk always. Kristen, anything else from those sermons about this section? No?
No, girl, you got it.
Thanks.
Good word today.
Okay, so tomorrow we'll get through a little bit more of this section, but for today we're going to hang it up. So I'll end the recording. If you're just watching that, then we'll see you tomorrow.